World War II left around 58 million dead, wiping out around 3% of the world's population. Diplomatic relations between world powers were ravaged. What better way to replenish hope in the world than by capturing surviving Nazi war criminals? Well, the US begs to differ because instead of capturing them, they gave them a new home. These bizarre Nazi documents reveal how the CIA recruited Nazi scientists and officers, even defending them from prosecution. But why war criminals, of all people? Let's find out today with Newfound History. It was the end of World War II, and the world was hopeful of a new beginning for the first time in years. The capture of Nazi Adolf Eichmann in May 1960 drew attention to capturing war criminals who had escaped justice during the post-war chaos. That's because Eichmann was a high-ranking member of Hitler's party, specifically one of the officers who organized the final solution of the Jewish question. This was the code phrase used by the Nazis to disguise their endgame genocidal plans. With 6 million Jews murdered as part of Eichmann and Company's final solution, along with other undesirables of the Nazi regime, Romani people, disabled individuals, and homosexuals, the trial of a high-ranking official like Eichmann was the pinnacle of justice, holding one of the worst war criminals of history accountable for their crimes. But the public did not expect the CIA's close involvement with at least 5 of Eichmann's associates, all of those found in newly declassified records by the US government. Even more disturbingly, the CIA approached at least 23 other war criminals and Nazis for recruitment into their ranks. This was all part of Operation Paperclip. And before we move into the CIA's motivations for supporting high-ranking Nazi German officers, let's first venture into the Austrian police department in early 1950. They were wondering what happened to Schutzstaffel officer Otto von Bolschwing, who had been a double agent recruited by the US once he realized Nazi Germany would lose the war in early 1944. As a mole, he sided with what he thought was the winning team, with the condition that he'd be spared from justice once Hitler was defeated. Prior to his betrayal, Bolschwing worked with Eichmann before World War II as part of a plot to expropriate Jewish property in Austria. The CIA labeled him as one of their top spy masters in Europe. Once the war was over, the Austrian government looked into Bolschwing due to war crime suspicions, of which he had many. As a reward for his loyal service in being disloyal to Hitler, the CIA helped him emigrate to the United States through a luxury cruise ship, expedited his application for a US visa, and hosted him in Boston for months. The CIA decided that all prosecutors who asked for Bolschwing's SS personnel file should be told that no files were available. Having terminated their working relationship, the CIA told Bolschwing only to contact them in case of a life or death situation. In the passing years, Bolschwing even became an executive of many drug and chemical companies, returned to Germany as a business consultant, and became a State Department representative for international development in India thanks to his many connections. Eichmann's associates had similar privileges, treated well, and were promoted to many positions of power in the US. Why, though? Once more, Operation Paperclip and the United States' desire to rise above all other countries. During the war against Nazi Germany, the US rushed to create new technologies that could counteract their enemy's own. After the war was over, former Nazi German scientists working on weapons of war were either unemployed or persecuted. So, an opportunistic US government recruited hundreds of these surviving Nazi engineers and technicians to work for them, looking to gain an edge over the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Obviously, the program was kept under wraps at the time. The US smuggled the former Nazis into their country through secret military planes or through fortified ports of entry. They fabricated secret identities and even had them work on fake companies and organizations as covers for these scientists. The goal was to masquerade all of their recruitment and research activities as legitimate business operations. As for the Nazi high officials, the US government made deals with them to protect them from prosecution in exchange for serving the country. That's why no court could ever find records on Bolschwing or his past. The declassification of these documents spawned a million million conspiracy theories about the CIA and the US government, and considering how the US lost more than 300,000 people in World War II, the ensuing moral and ethical debate was heated, to say the least. Regardless of anyone's moral stance on Operation Paperclip, we wouldn't have jet propulsion technology or hypothermia treatments had it not been for the German scientists. The US acquisition of aerospace engineers like Werner von Braun led to the development of the Saturn V rocket used in the Apollo missions to the moon. Without Nazi German scientists, the US may never have won the space race. This shows that even the morally grayest political decisions can impact history for good. That's not to say every Nazi high officer was taken to the US as a safe haven. Eichmann was captured by US liberators in Germany when fleeing the Hungarian capital after advancements from the Red Army. He was scheduled to be taken by the Israeli government for prosecution, yet managed to escape the prison camp in 1946 and arrived in Argentina in 1950, which was another safe place for Nazi war criminals. His luck would run out sooner rather than later, as he was found in 1956 when a German prosecutor informed Israel of Eichmann's whereabouts, and they captured him in early 1960. Knowing that Argentina wouldn't extradite Eichmann for trial, Israel's military abducted him and took him to Jerusalem illegally as he walked from the bus to home. He was drugged and disguised as an Israeli airline worker with head trauma from an accident. In just 3 days, Eichmann stood trial before Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. He faced 15 charges. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to die by hanging near Tel Aviv in 1962. But Operation Paperclip was the least worrying of the declassified Nazi documents. Far worse events occurred within Hitler's inner circle during World War II. Another of these presents us with an eyewitness account of Hitler's Tea Party. And yes, it is every bit as bizarre and terrifying as it sounds. Turns out that Adolf Hitler was really big on tea. He had a daily ritual of making a 20-minute walk from the Berghof to the tea house with his dog Blondie, his closest friends, and some of his political associates. They'd have tea, coffee, and cakes in British fashion. Usually he'd fall asleep after and would be taken back to the Berghof by car, others returned by foot. Even after one of his attempted assassinations and the US and Red Army moving deeper on both fronts, on July 20th, 1944, Hitler did not miss his daily tea ritual. This time, it took place at his headquarters. It was a conversation in German between Eugene Dollmann and SS Colonel George Elling. Dollmann described how the assassination led Hitler to a paranoid break, leading him to leap in a fit of frenzy with foam on his lips and claiming revenge on all traitors. Providence showed him that he had been chosen to make world history, and he shouted how he'd lead horrifying punishments for women and children who'd all be put inside concentration camps. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth to everyone who opposed him and divine providence. Dollmann mentioned how he instantly thought that Hitler had to be mad. He even wondered why he didn't return to the Allies when he had the chance, a mistake he'd sorely regret a year later, as he and George Elling would be rotting as prisoners of war in a British cage in Italy. There was only one other account of the event, which was cited in a 1947 book by British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who described a similar experience word for word. Dollmann had an influence on SS General Karl Wolff, the Schutzstaffel commander in Italy, and promoted the negotiations leading to Operation Sunrise. This was a covert intelligence operation carried out by the Allies during the latter stages of World War II in Europe. The operation aimed to secure the surrender of German troops in northern Italy to prevent them from continuing to fight against the Allies. Today, nothing remains of the building where once Hitler and associates would spend leisurely afternoons sipping tea, all while innocents were murdered at concentration camps with not a care in the world. And speaking of concentration camps, the final of these declassified documents, plus newly released images at Berlin's Topography of Terror, shed some light on one of the biggest mysteries of World War II, the identity of Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible was a nickname given to an infamous guard who worked at the Treblinka extermination camp. Keep watching and you'll learn why he earned such a sinister moniker. For the longest time, it was believed that Ivan the Terrible and John Demjanjuk were one and the same. He was quite a controversial figure in the history of war crimes and Nazi atrocities, a Ukrainian-American who supposedly served in the Soviet Red Army during World War II and later immigrated to the United States. He was accused in the 1980s of being the cruelest guard at the Treblinka concentration camp. How cruel? Well, Ivan the Terrible was said to have wielded an iron pipe or sword whilst ushering the prisoners, savagely beating them or cutting them as they went by. One survivor spoke of how he cut off and nailed people's ears to walls and gouged out eyes, whilst another spoke of rape and even infanticide. Although there were other guards known as Ivan at Treblinka, this one's duties were to run the tank engines feeding the gas chambers and shepherd the helpless to their horrific and tragic end. Supposedly, he was about 25 years old and known for his extreme cruelty. Getting back to the post-war, Demjanjuk settled in Ohio and worked as an auto worker at the Ford Motor Company. In 1980, he was accused of being Ivan the Terrible, as 9 survivors of Treblinka identified his photographs for his U.S. visa. After a lengthy legal battle, Demjanjuk was extradited to Israel in 1986 to stand trial for war crimes. However, he was ultimately acquitted due to a lack of evidence linking him to Ivan the Terrible. During the trial, the prosecution asked star witness Eliyahu Rosenberg if he recognized Demjanjuk. Rosenberg told Demjanjuk to remove his glasses so he could peer into his eyes. As Rosenberg loomed closely across Demjanjuk's face, he stepped back, horrified, and shouted "Grozny," which means terrible in Russian. Word for word, Rosenberg said, "I say it unhesitatingly, without the slightest shadow of a doubt. It is Ivan from Treblinka, from the gas chambers, the man I am looking at now. I saw his eyes. I saw those murderous eyes." Unfortunately, Rosenberg had previously testified in 1947 that Ivan the Terrible was murdered during a prisoner uprising. On top of that, conflicting identifications from Soviet archives were released, linking Ivan the Terrible with Ivan Marchenko. Ivan Marchenko is not on the most wanted Nazis list, and if he were still alive, he'd probably be more than 110 years old. Thus, Demjanjuk was ultimately found not guilty, as the evidence testifying against him was inconsistent. But that was not the end of his legal troubles. In the 2000s, Demjanjuk was again accused of being a Nazi death camp guard, this time at the Sobibor camp in Poland. He was extradited to Germany in 2009 to stand trial, and in 2011 he was convicted of accessory to murder and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He died while his appeal was still pending, and in the German legal system, this deems him technically not guilty. Now let's think for a moment. It's truly remarkable how someone can be accused of being 2 different Nazi death camp guards in their lifetime, isn't it? And the fact that he was acquitted in Israel and then later convicted in Germany just adds to the absurdity of the whole situation. But that still leaves the original question unanswered. Was Ivan the Terrible the same as John Demjanjuk? Newfound photos have placed him at one of the death camps yet again. From Berlin's Topography of Terror Museum, 361 previously unseen photos were analyzed using modern biometric technology. Some of these once belonged to Johann Niemann, the deputy commander of the Sobibor concentration camp. Shockingly, they show a man who's very likely to be Demjanjuk, crediting the theory that he was really Ivan the Terrible. Before these images, historians knew only of 2 photos from Sobibor, taken while it was still operational, and the camp was dismantled after a prisoner revolt took place in 1943. How many more Nazis escaped without prosecution? Hopefully not many. Hungry for more shocking history? You need to see this.